Hey there geeks, I'm Joe Holmes and this is where we talk about the big ideas in science fiction and fantasy, the science, philosophy, psychology, and more that underlies our favorite fandoms. Ever since I was 3 and made my mom buy me Star Wars sheets, I've been literally covered in geek culture. And we tend to think of geekdom as pretty lighthearted. We do these things that we love, these books and comics and movies and games and science fiction and fantasy because they're fun. But I think we geek out about things not just because they're fun, but because when we dive that deeply into something that we love, we learn new things about ourselves in new ways. Geeks, more than anything else, love to learn. So in this video series I'm doing two things, looking closer at the little things in fantasy and sci-fi and synthesizing them into a larger picture of a geekier world. For example, if you're like me, you spend a lot of time playing games, and my favorites have always been RPGs. Now RPGs span every genre imaginable, but when I mentioned role-playing games just now, I'm guessing about 90% of you thought of some version of this. High fantasy, Renaissance technology, dragons and dwarves and swords, your standard Lord of the Rings fare. We might take it for granted, but why is it that RPGs are so heavily associated with high fantasy? It's tempting to cite the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons and say that RPGs are beholden to high fantasy because that's where the first, best, and biggest ones started, and the apples just haven't fallen that far from the end. But I think there's another reason that even as we enter this renaissance of gaming where we're experimenting with all new genres, that we're still drawn back to the sandboxes of our youths, to Faerun and Golarion, to the dungeons and the dragons that protect them. To one degree or another, every game is a role-playing game, whether your role is as simple as black or as complex as your level 11 elven mage Melvin. You take on your character's traits and desires for the purposes of that game. And I would go even further and say that the only reason for a game is to provide a medium for a character and a player to achieve something together. And the more directly and intuitively the game system translates the player's will into the character's actions, the more immersive and real that role-playing feels. A good player-character interface is like a good condom. It keeps the player safe, but you can't tell it's there. Player acts as the ghost in the shell for whatever hero the game provides as an avatar. And fantasy settings, because of their sheer scale, tend to produce heroes that we admire not for the magnitude of their talents, but for the strength of their resolve. The vast odds that get stacked against our fantasy heroes dwarf their physical statures and abilities, and the only way they have to survive is by their force of spirit. This is why I think that fantasy is so often stuck in Renaissance technology. The heroes are meant to go toe-to-toe with nature, not have mastery over it already. Laser guns would make it an unfair fight. Whereas science fiction often dumps its characters in the midst of human flaws, fantasy sets its characters against those flaws to celebrate the glory of human achievement. Tests of courage, loyalty, and tenacity manifest as massive dragons, hordes of orcs, or thousand-mile journeys. So the reason Frodo couldn't just fly to Mount Doom was that the symbolism was in the way. So in a fantasy setting, more than any other, a player has the opportunity to cross swords with the very embodiments of evil, despair, treachery, even death. Listen to what R.A. Salvatore wrote in the journal of his main character Drizzt. Drizzt. I pray that the world never runs out of dragons. Drizzt. For the dragon is the quintessential enemy, the greatest foe, the unconquerable epitome of devastation. They are the ultimate test of the hero and the ultimate fright of the child. Drizzt. I do not credit any god of wizards with their creation, but rather the most basic imagination, wrought of unseen fears of those first reasoning mortals. We make the dragons as we make the gods, because we need them. Because somewhere deep in our hearts, we recognize that a world without them is a world not worth living in. I don't know how much literary advice we should take from a guy who names his characters like he's trying to save money on Wheel of Fortune, but what are you gonna do? I am not implying that games based on some other genre are bad or less worthy of your time by comparison. I'm a huge fan of the move away from the classic Tolkien-esque fantasy in games in general, and the diversity is only a good thing for games across the board. What I will say though is that when it comes time to face the really nasty foes, when the issues go from huge to gargantuan to colossal, I'll take broadswords and fireballs over spaceships and lasers. So drop a comment. What are your favorite RPGs to play and why? Favorite foes? Let me know. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this. And if you're not through adventuring, take a look at some of these other vlogs. Thanks for watching, keep having those big ideas, and stay fantastic.